in, just note down if there's anything decided on anything.
Also, if you're in the room, please remember to grab the QR code to sign in for the on-site tool, and so that we have recorded your attendance.
For tomorrow.
Oh, Ian says running a few minutes late, but I'll be there.
Okay, want to go ahead and get started?
Well, anyway, I
And-
think this is really like, it's very close. No, I'm minutes walking. Don't get sucked into something and then not get on. No, because I'm going to go straight from the ISA policy thing, so they're going to kick me out there and then I'm going to walk.
Okay, we've just heard that the IETF chair is going to be kicked out of something tomorrow. We're not going to inquire further than that. It is just after the top of the hour, so we're getting ready to start. Thanks everybody for joining us here at what is in fact IETF 119. We'll be fixing that. That, for those of you who are sports fan, is the GABA here in Brisbane. It is used for both cricket and Australian rules football, aka footy. It's an interesting contrast in kind of what cricketers wear and what footy players wear. I encourage you to go and look that up because it's very, very different indeed. We're going to go through a little bit of administrivia to start. This is the note well, since this is one of the first working group sessions for the week, especially if you're a new person to the IETF, you should be paying attention to this. And it's
Oh, you're on
interesting.
your.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Thanks. There we go. So this is the note well and not the GABA. Especially if you're new, you should take a quick look at all of the BCPs here, which include information on the standards process, working group processes, our anti-harassment procedures, our code of conduct, information about copyright, patents, and the privacy policy. So please familiarize yourself with this and note especially that if you have IPR on a particular idea and you bring it up in a working group meeting, you must disclose it to the IETF. That's the way we work. If there are any questions to that, I'm going to turn them over to the IETF chair. He's got another whole day to go, and he should be taking some of that. Seeing none, meeting tips. For those of you who are here in person, you're welcome to use the QR code that's on that screen to get the mobile version of this to join the queue and do other things. You're also welcome to use the full client if you want to be able to see the slides on your laptop, but please do be careful of the bandwidth and turn off the video streams you're not actually using. Also be very, very careful if you're using the full client to make sure that you remain both muted and video muted as you go. There is an ongoing chat in the client. It's also available via Zulip. Any questions on that? All right. For the administrivia, the normal thing to do at this moment would be spend 6 minutes trying to find a scribe. However, Magnus Westerlund, before the Meeting even started has volunteered. Thank you again, Magnus. If you're willing to volunteer for our second one tomorrow, please see one of the chairs afterwards and tell us what bribe in particular you're looking for, because we're very open to suggestions on that. We've been doing chocolate, but if it turns out you'd like finger limes or some other more Brisbane specific treat, just let us know. 2 PRs, okay. If you're willing to take notes, we might talk to you about landing a PR, but I will warn you, they might get backed out again afterwards. We don't necessarily claim they'll stay landing. That's a working group consensus issue. So is there anybody who needs to bash this day's agenda? Okay, seeing nobody interested in bashing the agenda, we'll now go to the hackathon review on MOQ 2. Readout from the hackathon review. I will note that there are actually two things here, and I'm going to refresh these slides while somebody else is talking. One of them is that the hackathon review mostly wasn't hacking here, but people doing it in airports. It was wonderful to watch the exchanges going on, because it was mostly like, okay, if I can get to this before my flight, I'm going to try it. And of course, Luke, who has both a toddler and a newborn, was hacking away despite the extreme lack of sleep that implies. So lots of dedication on his part.
Okay, so I think, as far as I know, there's still 6 implementations. I'm not sure if anybody else has started one that I'm not aware of. I think 5 of them have done all the code changes to implement draft 3. And then we're sort of in the process now of getting things to talk to each other. I think Suhas and Mathis got their setup working. Martin, I was getting close with Luke. Martin and I are going to hack this week. So we'll probably do like we did in Prague and spend some time in the code lounge this week. So just trying to push the things along now that we're here in person. But I think, and maybe we'll try to make one of those beautiful interop matrices when we're done at the end of the week and push that out. I might have to vamp longer because I don't see our next speaker in the room. Okay. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay. Share this.
Is this cross? Is this a target location?
That is not a boss.
Don't look up. Right.
So this is subscribe and fetch?
Yeah, subscribe. So you recall at the last interim meeting, there was, we had a lot of discussions about color. Sorry, this mic definitely seems off. Does somebody know where the on-off button is on this mic? We'll leave this.
Oh, there it is.
Test. Okay. So at the last interim, we talked a little bit about a bunch of different ways that we could hit the subscribe and a bunch of corner cases that we were coming into in the subscribe. So Jan and I have gone off and worked on this for a while and come up with a proposal. So next slide, please. Before we jump into this, I'm sure everyone's going to be like, yeah, as we start going through this, you're going to go, the first reaction will be, no, but then what about this or whatever. So let me sort of explain what this proposal is, explain a little bit why we came to this proposal. And once we sort of, and fine with clarifying questions all along the way on that of what's being proposed. But once we get to that, let's push off towards the end of like, hey, is this proposal worth doing or not? Let's get through what it is first. So next. Okay, next again. When we did the subscribe the first time, it was just like, oh yeah, we'll be able to put these numbers in that are absolute or relative that say where to start and where to stop. And then as we started doing it, it was like, wow, everybody has a different idea. Like the different elements that are working together, not different people, but the client and the relays, or two different relays, might have different ideas on what these numbers are at any given point in time of just the timing of things. Like when you say start from relative -1, what does that mean? And all those things. So we ran into a ton of corner cases on this. Next slide. There's a bunch more of these corner cases on this. And we were going through and thinking about all of the use cases that we'd seen and trying to make sure that we had a solution that met those, and then also dealt with all of these issues, like had fairly clear answers to all of these. So that's the solution I'm going to sort of describe here next. Next slide. Probably a couple more slides. Okay, one more slide. Okay. So there's a bunch of parts of this. I'm going to build up on them, okay? I'm going to start with the simplest part here, which is the subscribe part. And this is really only about getting to sort of the live edge or close to it. So what we're proposing is that when you do a subscribe, you can specify a starting point that is only, that talks about the data that's there and what you start getting. So instead of this sort of plus or minus ones, which took us down sort of some complicated things, or were hard to find exactly what a live edge was, or these things, we tried to make these a little bit crisper. So the current one is whatever, it's the group that is the largest group ID that you've received in the track. Whatever that one is the current one right now. So in my example here, we had a group of 17. The last one, which is generally the one before it, but to get a crisp definition of it, it's the largest group for which the relay has received the last object in the group. So you have the last, so, the red object right there before the green one, okay? So the last group in this one is 16. Sorry? Yes, that is another, we need to know that for many other reasons. That's sort of an open issue, but we're working on the assumption how exactly you signal the last object and things is still a little bit unknown, but we definitely need to know that. And then the next group is wait until the beginning of a group that is larger than the group that is the current group, that's your currently largest one. So this group 18. And look, these things these definitions are selected carefully to be very concrete. The relay knows what it needs to do, and they deal with issues like gaps or other things like that could happen. So that's the starting point for the subscribe. Next slide. We think of the relay as, the subscribe creating some state in the relay that sets up effectively a filter of what data is going to come to it. So as the relay gets objects after the subscriptions happened, it has a little bit of information it can look at and decides, do I forward this down to the person who did that subscription, or do I not forward it to that subscription? That's basically the decision that needs to happen with subscribes. So this range filter type idea was, I think Luke originally is the person who positioned it that way, but I think it's the right way to think about it. And so the other thing that we did is when we started looking at the use cases for the stop, instead of providing an absolute stop for the subscribe here, and we're going to get to fetch in a second, which is like a subscribe with more absolute numbers in this. This one's also relative. So you can say, I want to subscribe to, so a default subscribe would just be subscribing forever, right? For all the objects that come after the start point. But you can optionally add an end, which is a number of groups that you're going to receive that sets up the end filter of that. So the use cases for this was people who are like, I want to get the current group, but just that group. And then later, after I've received that data, I might make some other subscriptions or other information once I know what the current group is. So you'd set one as this. And it gets rid of all the errors that you could have in the case where, like, you put an absolute number in as a stop group, but you're already past that point in the stream or things like that, right? So this, again, because it's relative to where the start was. It's very simple and well-defined from the relay to know how to implement. Now, when a point of clarifying on this too is that when the stream starts moving on to groups that are larger than whatever this is, it's not like it cancels the subscribe or ends it or anything like that. That is done through signaling to do with the unsubscribe or the subscribe done or whatever we not do for it. This is just a filter of what objects get forward. Clear enough on this stuff so far? Okay, I'm seeing nods. Okay, next slide. So this does not, what I was just describing doesn't allow you to go get the data at the start or any of those things. So I'm going to talk about fetch here for a second. And as I say on the bottom of the slide, don't get hung up on the name of fetch. I mean, we could have fetch and subscribe be one thing, but logically speaking, we have at least two different styles of operation here, whether it's one method that does both or not. Okay, but the fetch only does absolute ranges. So you say a start and a start group and an end group, and it's going to get you that data. It also doesn't deal with future requests. So it doesn't deal with stuff that might show up in the future or may not show up in the future or any of that. It's just, this tells you what the system has now. So if a relay gets a request for an absolute range and it has it in its cache, great, it sends it. If it doesn't have it and it needs to request it upstream, it goes in upstream and gets it. And if it goes all the way upstream and some parts of the request are not available, it communicates that information down that at this point in time, that stuff's not available. This also makes it very easy for a relay that got fetch requests from different clients for overlapping ranges, but not exactly the same range, to keep track of what it's doing, because it's all absolute numbers. So if the first client asks for 1 to 10, and the next client asks for, and so that the relay requests that upstream, and it knows it has an outstanding request for 1 to 10 on this given track. And then the next thing asks for 5 to 15. It knows that it already requested some of that range, and it could do the right thing of demuxing that if it wanted, and sending the upstream request just for the subset of the 5 to 15 that it's, or sorry, the 10 to 15 that's missing. Next slide, I've got a little bit more on this. So it also, it finds out about non-available objects in the region. It doesn't try and figure out why they're not available or they might be available later or whatever. It's just like, here's the data now. Also, one of the things that we've really felt like was grossly simple, or gross is the wrong word, but greatly simplified this, would be delivery order of this fetch data isn't guaranteed exactly. And I'll get to why I think this is okay in a second. So let's say the relay had cached, let's say I requested objects 1 to 100, and the relay had cached 90 to 100. It could deliver me 90 to 100 right away, and then it could deliver me the 1 to 90 in whatever order it got it. That really simplifies some of those things. And the issue that how we figured this out, that's not an issue, is that when you're in the type of use cases where you're using fetch, you are actually, the client, if it cares about the order, it can make multiple fetches for the orders it wants. So if it wanted to move forward in time, it could have requested 1 to 10 as one fetch and 10 to 20 as the next fetch, in the same way that an HLS dash system would do. Or if it wanted to get its most recent data back and then move back, like if instead of requesting 1 to 100, it requests 90 to 100 first, if that's what it wanted. Okay, I see a couple questions in the queue here. Yep.
Okay, so are you going to talk more later about how fetch interacts with deliver, or like the stream mapping? Because what you just said, okay, then I will save my question.
Yeah.
Let me clarify why I was. So the reason I'm asking is that what you just said, which is that I asked for 0 to 100, say objects within one group, and the relay has 90 to 100. If the stream preference is per group, it can't send me 90 to 100 because it can't go backwards, or something like that. Anyway.
Right. And we also have I'm going to talk about this, pretty sure I have a little bit later, but not quite that issue, but also the issue is if you request something twice, if you requested 10 to 50 and then 40 to 70, like if you do or just never, I mean, that was too complicated. If you do a fetch and ask for 0 to 10, and right after that, you request 0 to 10 again, you get it twice. Okay, the fetches are very much, who knows why you requested it twice. We'll assume the client knows what it's talking about. I have a little bit more on slide later on that, but not much. Victor.
Yeah, so I mean, I understand why you would want to not guarantee delivery order, but there are cases in which, like, if I want to request 1 to 100 in reverse order, that kind of would mean that I have to send 100 requests. So I think there's some room to ask for something that you're not necessarily going to get.
Say a little bit more on that. I'm not quite sure I quite followed you.
Well, what I'm saying is it's the server will have, like, the relay will have to send them in some order. So it might as well want to know what order the client wants them in, because the client probably has some idea of what order it wants them in, typically either in one direction or another. And it can also indicate how much it cares, which is like it could not care at all. It can care a little bit. I agree that it is very nice that we do not guarantee anything, but what I'm pointing out that there is still use in communicating what the client actually wants.
That makes complete sense. I agree with you on that. So.
It's clear that fetch is object-based. You can ask for individual objects. The previous slide suggested that subscribes now would be only at group boundaries, and it's only object 0. Is that part of the plan?
You are correct. We had, let's go back 2 slides here.
I was hoping we could still retain the ability to start at a non-zero object, because if you think about the like rehydration case, or connections going down, you already had half of the group, and you just want to renew your subscription at the point that you don't that you started missing things. So I guess you could do a subscribe at the next group and then do a fetch for that, but it just seems like a little bit more mechanics.
Go back 1 more slide here.
Was that a conscious decision to limit things to object 0?
We had another proposal on here at one point in time, and it's moved to maybe the last slide in the deck, or maybe deleted from the last slide of the deck, which was now. So we got these 3 options here. We had another option now, which was the current object inside of the current group instead of just starting there. And it was a conscious decision to be like, you know what? Let's get through having these things first and then decide if we need those extensions, if we need to add that. So we certainly weren't trying to rule out that possibility of starting in any of those positions, but we're trying to get to sort of agreement that we need at least this much before we jumped into those.
Okay. I think there are good use cases for starting at a non-zero object. So
right.
if people agree, let's try to add that back in.
Okay. Can that make the minutes?
Is this for subscribe or fetch?
For subscribe, yeah. Who else is in the queue? Luke.
Yeah, apologies if you hear the newborn. I was going to say for this slide, I would also want subscribe to know about what's not available and what's being dropped. Just because there's a case now where you're ambiguous, where it's like, I don't know if group 8's ever going to come. So it's nice that fetch has this property, but it's a property I'd also like for subscribe.
So the problem that we had with that, Luke, is we tried to put that in, and we don't know how subscribe we don't know how the relay will ever know whether that's going to happen or not. Now, the original publisher might, but it's, we were trying to figure out what's the driving use case for that, because it seemed like most of the use cases that needed that, it would most likely to be fetch that you were using at the time to get the data. Now, I mean, no problem with marking some group as like some way of indicating that a group doesn't exist or something. But we were struggling on the use cases that needed that in fetch versus in subscribe.
I think you'll probably have a similar problem with fetch, but I mean, I would just have groups be sequential personally, so you can detect gaps. But anyway, keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So one of the other things that we came around and trying to get the edge cases to go away is that if relays cache, they should cache at least the last and current group. So that's basically they have to cache 2 groups worth as a minimum. They can cache more, obviously, but they have to have That is what would allow this subscribe stuff to work in a very consistent way. So this is a additional, tax that we're putting on people who implement relays that cache, but it doesn't seem very much. And if we have this, it certainly removes a bunch of the edge cases. So that was one of the things that we added that really simplified going through some of the flows. Next slide. Okay, and next slide again. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got to some of the parts in this design. There's not too much in here. Part of it is, that there's two really different things that we're controlling on, that we're dealing with a lot on the relays, and that's the forwarding and fan out, and the other part's the cache. And the subscribe sets up a state in the relay that tells it what it should forward. It's a forwarding table, and not much else. And so that's about when data comes in, you know what to do with it, of where to send it next. The fetch is a fairly different operation in some levels. Is it tells the relay to do whatever it needs to do to get a copy of exactly the data you asked for. And if it can't do that, to tell you, it can't do that. And these are fairly different operations at some level when we started, separating them out and going through all the little edge cases on them. So next slide. The no relative cache. So when we tried to do relative fetch, we which of course ran into all kinds of corner cases of the client doesn't know exactly, the client and the relay have different ideas of where they might be in time or where the current things are. So that's a lot of our current bugs came out of trying to have relative requests on a fetch type thing. Now, this results in these overlapping things that are very hard to reason about. You saw that count, like you just go back and look at the, us all at a whiteboards trying to figure it out, the previous meetings or all of the discussions, previous meetings, obviously hard to reason about, and hard to debug, hard to get all of those things in. So we're like, if we can avoid this, this would be great. Next slide. Oh, sorry, back one slide. I'm going to talk about a thing on the other one. So I think that one of the things that does come out of this one is that when we really looked at it, it's like, well, even if you only had to subscribe for a current group to find out where things are and then use some fetches to get some old historic data that you needed, you probably could do this, and you probably wouldn't add a relevant RTT. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. But so it didn't seem like removing relative fetch was dramatically impacting any of the use cases that we could look at. It looked like a combination of subscribe and fetch could always meet the needs. Next slide. And this comes back a little bit to Alan's question. So subscribe ID or track alias, and this has been a topic of some confusion of like, clearly we don't need both of these, but which one do we need? And as we started thinking about this stuff more, we realized that actually the subscribe largely uses something very much like, it basically needs, the data that's coming in subscribe needs a track alias, is pretty much what it is and what it wants to come from. However, the data from the fetch, particularly once you make the jump that if you do two identical fetches for the same stuff, you're going to get two copies of the same object, and you probably want to know which one of those two fetches the object was associated with, even though it's the same object. You end up wanting to have an identifier that's matched to that fetch. I'll call it fetch ID here, but it's what would be called subscribe ID in the things that we currently have written. So we actually end up with the idea that in a given object that's being delivered to you, you don't need both of these fields. It depends whether it was coming from a subscribe or a fetch. But the semantics of what goes in that data is slightly different depending on whether it came from a subscribe or a fetch. And this actually helped clear up a bunch of our stuff. Next slide. And then I'm close to the end here. Why fetch and subscribe versus just subscribe? As soon as we combine the two together, we start ending up with these combinations of things that are not legal. So if we had one method called subscribe that could do both what I described as fetch in these slides and could do the stuff I described as subscribe, you start ending up with fields like, well, it can do this. When it's in subscribe mode, it can do these relative things, but when it's in the fetch mode, it can do the absolute things. And it just seems quite a bit more complicated to reason about that than just having two separate methods with very clear semantics of what they do and what type of errors they want. Obviously, this is effectively editorial. If the working group, if people felt strongly about this, we can put them into one instead of two. But I think the three of us all felt like this just was easier having them separated than having them together. And Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan, maybe I've missed something, but how is the client knowing what the absolute numbers are for the fetch? Does it have to subscribe first to figure out what the head is and then fetch?
Yeah, pretty much. Or that it knows something from the catalog, right? That's the other way it could know something. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about the, I'm 15 minutes late to the meeting, so I want to fast forward before watching it use case, where I don't want to be receiving the current head because I'm not going to see it.
From one slide for me here. Just let me. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this actually gets to somewhat the use case of speeding up. So one of the questions on that is, I walked in 15 minutes late for the meeting, and I want to do it. So, and I want to catch up. Now, so this comes to, why don't we allow something earlier than last to the subscribe? I want to subscribe to minus 15 minutes, for example, and then carry on. The groups, so what we decided we didn't need that, and that in this case, we probably would be all right with the RTT, and I'll get to why in a second. So you do a subscribe for the last group or the current group, with the optional thing of how much do you want to subscribe to set to 1. Now you know all your information, you can go do your fetches that you need. When we started thinking about how much time, what is the group size? Okay, on tons of the common systems are fairly live like this. It might be like a 5-second group size. Well, why is it 5 seconds? It's because that's about how much time you'd be willing to wait or buffer forward. It goes together with the human factors of it. So we decided that the group sizes are set large enough to make the user experience work well, that a single group is probably all you need in a very, very short real-time component where one extra round trip hits you. So let's just say that somebody proposed, last -1, that went one farther back on that. We could do that. We could just add another enum for last -1, but we don't think you really need it. We think in that case, the user experience will be almost exactly the same as if you ask for last and then use a fetch to go get the last -1. And it has to do with the fact that these group sizes are set up to be relatively large relative to the RTTs. Does that make any sense, Jonathan? Are you buying this? Okay.
One problem I see is that this assumes that clients are okay with concurrent delivery of all of the groups and objects if they're doing piecemeal subscribes and fetches and everything. Whereas if they really wanted all of the bandwidth to be devoted to things in order, I want to start playing out right now, what I asked for, that would slow down the play out, because now the 5-second back group that you're asking for is competing with also the live edge that you had to subscribe to in order to get information about that 5-second prior.
Yep.
So now you're getting it all in parallel, and it's slower. And so you have a delay in play out that may not be good for the app.
You're getting a little bit longer queue, and I know you only have 2 slides left in your presentation. Do you want to just?
Yeah, let's just hit the last 2 slides and then let me go through the queue. Yeah. Well, whatever. Okay. So I think we're into that discussion, and then let's show me the last. It's the now slide. Is the last slide, or what's the last slide after this one?
This is the last one.
Oh, okay, great. I think we're at a great place to take the cue.
Okay, great. We got a nice long queue.
Yeah. Jonathan, again, just to respond to that, I feel like maybe this is too much designing at the mic and too much into the weeds, but I kind of feel like for the go back 15 minutes case, the thing is you don't actually want to get those objects. You want to know what the head is, the number of the head. But so I feel like maybe you want something that is to subscribe as head is to get in HTTP, but maybe that's too much in the weeds.
So Jonathan, I totally agree. I think I had always assumed that we would end up wanting something that where it was like an option that's like, tell me the names of the objects effectively, but don't give me the data inside of them. So I think that would be a really, I've always assumed we'd add that sort of extension eventually anyway. So that seems like a really good positive thing.
Martin Duke, Google. So in Denver, I was a fetch skeptic. I've actually found this quite convincing, and I would be pretty happy with this framework. I think the whole I think this is kind of I think it's a second order question about how we adjudicate this. I want to watch the whole thing, but starting from zero. We can avoid buffering quite as much by sending a total of 3 messages if you subscribe to just literally one group to get the ID, and then
fetch
do
back,
everything, then fetch everything, and then do another subscribe once you get to the right point. That sounds a little inelegant, but I mean, I think we can live with it if it comes to that. But I mean, we could probably spell this message in a way to avoid that case if we really want to put in the effort. But
when you say it that way, I'm like, oh yeah, it sounds a little inelegant.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that we were striving to is how can we form some primitives that we can do every operation with and not add more basic primitives than we need. And like we can get it with those 3 like that. And it didn't seem like it would impact the user experience to do that.
I agree, probably would not impact the user experience. And even if we conceptually compose it of these primitives and have like a message that consolidates those primitives like that, I think that would be fine as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Jana Iyengar, just one comment on to that, which is, the goal here, I'll second what Cullen said, which is to find the right primitives is powerful. If you find the right primitives, then you can compose them in various ways, and you can reason about the composition, which I think is very powerful. And then you can abstract the composition into a separate message if you really, really think that's important, but commonly we don't. I wanted to respond to Mo's question earlier as well about bandwidth utilization across these different things. I think that's a broader question, not limited to subscribe and fetch. It's to fetch and fetch as well. And you're going to have to deal with that. I would argue that's a prioritization question, and broader scope and separate.
Luke?
Yeah, no worries. So just to step back a little bit, I think the goal of fetch is to simplify things, right? It's trying to take something that's complicated and subscribe. It's just a big complicated like toolbox. I think the problem though is I don't actually see the implementation really changing with fetch. I see it as now I have to juggle fetch and subscribe at the same time instead of just trying to juggle subscribe by itself. I imagine like a relay is going to share the same cache between fetch and subscribe. It's still going to need to treat them almost as the same. It's just going to have a different keyword for doing it. And I really, 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 as somebody who worked in HLS a lot, I want to get away from like, no, I'm not requesting making a fetch every 2 seconds. Like I'm not doing that anymore. That's and I don't want like, if the idea is to be simple, it's not doing it. It's making it harder. I think it's just making everything harder, this proposal, honestly. And I do like the idea of trying to make things simple by breaking the primitives. It just doesn't do enough. It makes it harder. Sorry.
Luke?
Okay, you're responding to Luke.
A question specifically to Luke. Luke, what specifically does this make harder?
Well, so the relay needs to combine fetches and subscribes. It needs to know that a relative subscribe is going to share the cache with an absolute fetch. It needs to somehow take the objects it received from the subscribe and put them in the fetch cache. And I think the big one is just for clients. Like if you start playback and I can only receive subscribe for new stuff, it means my protocol needs a way of knowing about what old stuff was so I can fetch it first to then start subscribing. I just want to just send a subscribe. Like I don't want to have these like this dual mode constantly.
But
and
I'm not in your universe, and I'm sorry, I don't want to take a lot of time, but I just want to tell me when to stop. In your universe, if you just send a subscribe, what does that actually mean?
Well, what do you mean? What does it mean? It basically, I think Cullen said it really well in the slides. It's a range filter. A subscribe is say, give me everything from this start range to this end range. And if something matches it, send it to me. Fetch is weird because fetch is, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how those interact. With subscribe is give me this range, and fetch is also give me this range, but I want it slightly differently.
I mean, is your subscribe effectively understood? Thank you.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so from the implementer who was trying to implement this subscribe the waste defined today multiple times, I greatly like this proposal. For one big reason is that there's no relative offsets, and the scope of the relative offsets has been reduced to three enumerations, if I may call so, and which is very simple. It greatly simplifies release implementation, and also it simplifies. It makes the scalability for the major use case, which is like pub sub and store and forward, really useful. And for that reason, I would like to do +1 on this framework. And also, I like the way the last is defined. That would make most of the use cases that's been brought about the players needing to have some playout buffer ready before they start playing, which is very common in the streaming cases where the live edge is not right now but a few seconds before, and the last kind of addresses this use case. And anything beyond that in the past is not live edge anymore, and that falls into a clear category of a fetch, wherein I really don't care if it comes a slightly delayed, because it's already way behind my live age, and I should be totally okay with it and dealing with that fetch. So the subscribe with the current next, but the last giving a slight peek into the past solves most of the live edge and the interactive kind of use cases, and fetch going back where you don't worry about live edge makes total sense. So thank you for working on this framework.
So I think this is the right direction to have messages that map very cleanly to the application semantics, rather than having one huge overloaded method that has dozens of complicated corner cases and invalid and valid and the gray areas. So I think this is the right direction. The other things I think may be missing is that the primitives that we need, I'm not sure are all here. One of the ones that we talked about earlier was having like a parked subscribe. You're doing subscription, but you don't want to start the data flowing to you. Just want to pre-warm it at the relay. And I think that may be useful for what we just mentioned. Just getting the live head, you could do a parked subscribe, and the subscribe okay would give you what the live head is, but it's not actually streaming the objects to you. So that could be a primitive that actually gives you what the live head is, so that you can then do your real fetch or your real subscription based on that. But I think that's an important primitive that we should add. And if it's another message, I'm fine with that too. I think our message space is big. We shouldn't try to overload everything onto one message.
Right. I think that, I mean, this certainly was, we were trying to make this orthogonal from the parked issue, but this certainly, this easily works with parked. So that makes sense. And maybe that, I hadn't thought about that, what you're saying, that solves some of these issues a little bit to have that as well. Who do we have next on queue? Turk.
Hi, Colin. Quick question. Do you envision scenarios where you need to rate control these fetch requests?
Yeah, so I think everything that's coming to us, I'm not, so we didn't talk, I shouldn't speak for all three of us or anything, but we didn't talk extensively about rate limiting the fetch requests. But clearly the data that's coming back from them, this needs to fit into the overall prioritization, ordering issues, congestion, all of those things. We were just seeing as this is asking for what you're trying to ask for. The methods of how it comes to you and what order that comes in exactly, that will just happen the same ways that would happen in that's in the draft at all right now. And so we're not trying to change any of that. And that obviously prioritization is an open issue in the draft that we're going to attack at some point, but this would be subject to that. Okay. Yeah.
Thank
you. I'm trying to understand. So, do I understand correctly that like the key separation between subscribe and fetch is subscribe is like I'm subscribing for things in the future with a filter, and fetch is here is a range. Please return me well-defined semantics for what you're asking. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, and if you and so fetch is primarily about the past somewhat too, right? If you ask for things that don't exist yet, at the point of fetch, they don't know whether they don't exist, will never exist, or any of those things. You're just going to find out don't have them, right? That's all you're going to get from the fetch.
Okay, so my question is, so currently subscribe as it's presented on slides allows you to fetch like one group back. what are the semantic properties / guarantees on that being resolved or not?
So that's where we, so it turns out if the relay doesn't cache at all, that's no big deal because the subscribe just goes up, right? But if this is to make that work so that it was guaranteed to work, what we needed to do was add that one line of that tax on the relays that if a relay caches at all, it should cache the last and current group. My take is, this is a question for the room writer. I have a hard time imagining there's going to be somebody stand up and it's going to be like, no, we're going to build caches, but we're only capable of caching a single group, not two groups. I suspect that if you're down to caching that little, you're going to cache 0. So it didn't seem like a big tax. And as soon as you know that it's either those two groups are both there or it's 0, if it's 0, then you're just going to go upstream until you hit something that does cache, even if that's the very original publisher. So I think this gets us out of all the sort of corner cases on that one.
Okay, because I'm trying to understand what's like the principle between that and like subscribe where you do not get anything except for future, which is like the very more like.
I mean, okay, fair. So the reason we wanted to keep that one in was if you're trying to join the live edge to sort of like minimize the, not have an extra round trip time in the very common use case of like join me now, basically, for some loose definition of now.
Okay, yeah, I'll yield my place in the queue to Martin.
Martin Duke, Google. So I would argue this makes it simpler where it matters, which is the application API. When I implemented MOQT, an MOQT layer, I wasn't going to like store stuff in there, and so I already had this distinction where, like, if I get a subscribe that starts at the past, I have to go ask the application to provide all this other data, but I'm also like looking for new data and passing that, and so there was this kind of. So I had to like sort of have that API. This guy really makes it explicit in the spec, which I think is better. Even from the client side, yes, like the internal MOQT message becomes a little more complicated because you're sending like 2 or 3 messages. But the application API can still give me this range, right? You can still say I want 10 to forever, and that's decomposed in the messages in MOQT. But the application is still very, very simple. So that's one of the real appeals I see here. Thanks.
Luke again.
Yeah, I just want to say I think Will and I should give like a presentation on like HLS and Dash and what the current problems are. I think I like that there's at least a previous. It sounds like just talking in the chat, there is a previous group that's cached, but there's just like I don't want to have group sizes even be known up front. For example, like the fact that you have to know 2-second groups or 4-second groups is one of the main problems with HLS Dash today. But at the same time, like I
want to be careful here, Luke. There's nothing in this proposal that the relays, that anything in MOQ knows anything about the size of the video group size.
Well,
right?
One of your slides said that the player would know ahead of time what the size is, so they can then request the absolute.
Okay, that's probably a mistake on my slides. Let's just jump back to that for a second then, because I probably didn't mean to write that. I think we were implying that often the group sizes would be large enough relative to the stuff. Can you go back about, I think it's about 3 slides.
I would just like, for example, to have be able to do stuff like have a new group on a scene cut or something. So maybe a group could be half a second long. And I think that kind of breaks the last proposal because I also need a jitter buffer large enough for that. I think kind of the Victor's point, like if you're going to let one group in the past, like why not let N in the past? And that's kind of where we went.
Okay, so yeah, it was this slide effectively. So, I just want to be clear. I don't think there's any need for the MOQ or relay level to know anything about the size of the video group size. The scene cut for small group size was one of the things I was thinking about. I think it should work for that. I'm glad to sort of work through those sort of cases and make sure it does. And I also don't think that you need to handle the objects. With the cache. Anytime a relay receives an object, it doesn't matter where it came from, it drops it in the cache. Anytime it's looking for stuff, it can look in the cache. I don't think there should be like separate caches for anything or anything complicated about managing any of that. So I think a bunch of this, I think what we're proposing, and maybe we just need to get this down to a very specific PR, is pretty close to, I think, what you're thinking about, but it definitely does remove some of the things you're thinking of. So.
Yeah, I just think it dumps a lot of complexity on the player, and that's just why I don't like it.
Okay. Peter.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. So I'm just wondering what happens if there are very large groups like there typically are for real-time applications. And if we say that the relay should cache the last and the current, and someone comes along and says, okay, I want the last, or even just the current, and it's 10 minutes long, that's not very useful for video. So would we have some mechanism like a TTL from the client, the publisher, to say, cache this, but after a while, don't bother anymore?
Yes, the TTLs would still override that should we had there. I didn't have that on slide. That would be a really great clarifying point that I hope makes it to the minutes, and we'll fix it. Any TTLs on the objects or other things that tell you to discard them out of the cache for whatever reasons take priority over this the should we have that says you should cache the current and last object. And I totally agree with you on that, Peter.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I guess the question to the group at this point, is there anybody who would object to taking the next step on this, which would be the very specific PR? This is heading in such a bad direction that we shouldn't put the effort in to do that part. Okay, so it sounds like
Luke jumped in the queue.
Luke jumped in the queue. Okay, I'll unlock so Luke can answer.
Yeah, I would like a chance to do another proposal as well. Either write a PR or next presentation at the interim.
Okay, so it sounds like we will get a PR that implements this, and Luke will either comment on that, or if it needs an alternative, he'll create an alternative. Okay, so as a follow-up, the PR will be available tomorrow, and we already have a slot tomorrow for subscribe fetch follow-up.
Ian Sweat, Google. I have one clarifying question. Is there any issue with this proposal that's like an issue like this does not work for some like really severe case? Because it'd be great to know like if there's some like fatal flaw with this.
So there's a lot of stuff in the chat that points out that there's a lot of interaction between this and priorities, and we don't have priorities sorted.
I agree with that.
So it's kind of hard to know whether that's a fatal flaw or merely mildly maimed until we get the priorities stuff sorted.
My comment, a lot of these things are quite related. And so like, for example, I'd like to talk more about, hopefully later, about subscribe update, but like, until you know what subscribe is, it's hard to talk about subscribe. Like at some point we might have to go in a direction and then resolve other adjacent things and then fix things up. But if there's something critical that we know now that's a huge problem that we should address, let me know as the PR out there, I guess.
Okay, and let me just say that if you could review the chat, there's some things in there that I think would be useful to help you craft that PR between now and the next one. I have Luke in queue, and then Jonna. Jonna, why aren't you getting in the queue?
I am. Just on the virtual
Luke is before you.
Yeah, I would just say like there's a lot of stuff about TTL and prioritization and stream mapping, what Alan brought up, that have kind of become tricky to deal with, especially with fetch. And I do feel like we're gonna run into those. So I do want to talk about those more and figure out what we actually want out of the protocol and maybe ways we can do it today, and then see if that meshes with fetch. Maybe the proposal has to change because stream groups don't matter. Exactly. Stuff doesn't quite work.
Thanks, Luke. Jonna, then Suhas, and then I see Cullen trying to enter the queue. And then I think we're going to cut at the end of Cullen to move on to our next question. So Jonna.
Jana Iyengar Fastly. 2 comments. One, I don't see anything on the chat that really is debilitating, has debilitating issues. Sure, there are unresolved issues, but that's my second point. We have to move forward on this, I think, to be able to make sense of the subsequent issues. I think there are general issues on prioritization and other things, which are very meaty issues to get to. And I would love for us to get to them and spend more time on those personally. And I think that would be good for the group as well. So I think we can always reconsider things. Nothing is done in a working group, right? We know this. But if we can move forward at least and figure out why this breaks something in the future, that would be wonderful. So I look forward to the PR and discussion on it.
Okay, Suhas?
I agree with Jana here. We did the same thing with subscribe locations. We had proposals and we were not sure about if it'll work or not. We gave 2 to 3 interims to implement it, and we came back saying that no, it does not work as we expected it to work. So we are at a point where there's something that seems promising. Yeah, we might not have all the answers, but this is the point we need to kind of make a decision and say, let's go. Like as we did multiple times in this group, and if this solves the problem. And I agree with Luke that we need to think about the TTL and stream mapping. I did spend some time on it. I don't see it as a blocking factor. I'm happy to discuss at some point, but at this point in time, this looks like we need to kind of move forward and not slow down the working progress right now.
Cullen.
Cullen Jennings. I think that priorities are a big topic. Obviously, we've spent a lot of time talking about them. We didn't come to convergence. There's a bunch more to do with that. And I think we have to implement and collect data. It's really hard to implement without having this stuff sorted out first. So I really would not want to hold up making a decision on this until we figure out our priorities thing. I think we should make a decision on this, do our priority stuff, and our priority stuff may reveal the decision we made here was wrong. I'm fine with that. But I think that we just need to pin some stuff down and keep making good progress on that, and we need to do that. TTLs and stream orderings might be a little bit easier than priority, but I can't see how to do those without doing priorities at the same time because those two are so tied together. So I really favor just running code effectively on some of this stuff.
Okay, so it looks like tomorrow what we will get is a PR that represents sort of a more concrete version of these slides. And the authors will, review the chat, see what the issues were, and see if they can put into the PR. Maybe it's just to-dos, that says in the PR, to-do include reflection on X or Y. That may be the right way, given where we are right now. But reviewing the chat on the discussion there would be very helpful. So we don't have to have the same discussion again tomorrow with the PR. So now, from an agenda perspective, we are going back in time slightly. Originally, before Subscribe and Fetch, we're going to do a quick review of the MOQ updates in Draft 3. Ian, that's you. Luke mentioned that he had serious concerns. And that's what a competing.
Thank you. Could you pop up the slides? I'd say this update is both in some ways incremental, but also really cleans up a number of things. Yes, as you can tell, we're in Bris Vegas. If you didn't already know, you can look up what that is online. Is a colloquial nickname for where we are. Next slide. But Draft 3, a lot of it is tightening up things that were unclear before. The previous draft introduced the ability to subscribe to these relative ranges, absolute ranges, and a whole number of other things that now we're kind of rehashing. That was a huge chunk of functionality to add and a big change. And so some of this is sorting that out. In terms of the total number of open issues, it's not inordinately high. Obviously, more issues will be filed as time goes on, but certainly the number is trending down in a way that's I am cautiously optimistic about. A few need a PR. Some of those might be ambiguous. Some of those might be straightforward. But yeah, nonetheless, I think the draft is heading in a good direction. Next slide. In terms of kind of really substantial updates, in particular ones that are wire format breaking, we added the largest group and the largest object ID to subscribe OK, which is kind of relevant to this conversation. So now when you subscribe, you will know what the largest current group and object are. We changed it from datagram preferred, which allowed you to send things over datagrams or individual streams if datagrams did not fit over the MTU, were not supported, whatever reason, to datagram only. Folks seem to like this better. We also require datagrams to be supported on the next slide, but relevant to that. So like this all kind of, but web transport already requires datagrams to be supported. So de facto, this is probably not a big change for almost anyone. Fin and reset were merged because they're awfully similar. And we didn't want more messages. Again, we allowed the final group object to be known and subscribe done. So that way when the publisher ends a subscription for whatever reason, it'll actually tell you kind of what you need to wait for and what the last object and group will be. And we also added announce cancel, which is sort of parallel to the ability to cancel a subscription. So next slide. There are a number of clarifications. Yes, objects are identical if they have the exact same sequence of identifiers. I think we clarified what role meant, which was somewhat ambiguous before. So now it's clear you can be a publisher, a subscriber, or both. And you indicate that during the setup process. Trap namespace is basically an opaque blob that is matched exactly. There's no kind of more clever matching there. We tried to clarify what expires does and subscribe. That's certainly an area I think we probably are going to want to refine in the future. But at least now it's kind of clear it is an advisory field that says, hey, this might expire at this time based on what I know right now. I'm not guaranteeing it'll last that long. I'm not guaranteeing I won't allow it to last longer, so on and so forth. But like, you might have to resubscribe around this point. Yes, required datagrams. And if your subscription fails, you cannot send objects for it. Again, seems pretty obvious. It failed. You shouldn't send something for it. But now we know for sure. So next slide. Okay. Areas of future focus. Subscribe, which is now the past presentation, is a big one at the moment. We've talked or alluded to prioritization, TTL, things like that. I'm kind of bucketing these all under transmission, which is, given I have stuff to send, what do I send first? At what point do I give up on sending it? That entire category of problems. There are a few details about the object model that I think we want to refine more. I'll talk about probably one or two of those later. I think the core object model at this point is reasonably good in how it maps onto streams. But there are some issues like knowing when things end, knowing why there's a gap. What does the gap mean? And farther off in the future, I think we will probably want to revisit the handshake a bit. There are questions about whether either side can initiate it. There's questions about extensions. No one's ever really written an extension because this is so new. It's not even kind of close to a V1. But at some point, we need to make sure that extensions are possible, so on and so forth. Yeah, that's kind of any questions, comments, anything I missed? I did try to go over all the PRs and issues that were landed since Prague.
I'll maybe make one comment.
Oh, yeah.
Just that for folks who didn't attend the interim and this is the difference between draft 2 and draft 3, but there was a pretty significant difference between draft 1 and draft 2, which we covered in our interim. So if you're finding yourself a little lost, you may want to go back and check out those minutes or look at those deltas.
Yeah. Some of these did happen, I think. Oh, you're right. Some of them happened between.
The stream model, the object model mapping streams was introduced in draft 2.
Okay, and that was after Prague. I apologize. Okay. Yes, the interrupt slides would be helpful in that case. Jana
and Fastly in the queue this time. I just wanted to understand in transmission, what to send, etc. Do you have like the idea of congestion control and various things in there as well, and encapsulated inside of that, or is that separate? When I say congestion control, I mean, like I'm not talking about hop, but I'm talking about source, relay, client, that kind of congestion control.
Initially, my intent is to focus on one core question, which is I have stuff to send, where stuff is more than one thing. Mm-hmm. What do I send first? Yeah. And at what we keep talking about TTLs, we keep talking about dropping, we keep talking about reliability.
Yep.
At what point do I decide I'm not going to send it anymore? And we don't have good answers to either of those questions at the moment.
Fair enough. That's what I meant. I mean, what you want to send is accompanied with what do you not send. So
right, yes. So like, just it's as simple as that at its core, but obviously like the details matter. Lucas.
Hello, Lucas here. Just on the extensions thing, like, I would just wonder if you could elaborate a bit more for like the benefit of people who aren't tracking more closely. Specifically, like, I think it's fine if there aren't extensions right now and we don't need to create a dummy extension, but like, what are the extension points of MOQ transport? Are they clearly defined, or?
There are parameters in the setup message. So it's similar to settings in, HTTP3, but a bit.
So just ignore them if you don't understand them. Like, is that the kind of level of text we're thinking of in the future, or is it something we don't need to worry about right now? That's what I'm kind of trying to understand.
I believe it is something we do not need to worry about right now, but I think we will want to, ideally we would have an example extension, ready, obviously not like for an RFC, but like ready to go and kind of using the mechanism before we publish the draft, just to make sure like things actually work. That would be my thought.
Have you considered a greasing extension?
I certainly have. I don't think we've done it yet, but that's that would be a great issue to file to remind us not to forget.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Probably should have just closed the queue before I showed up. Just briefly, even if we like botch the extensions, we also have the versions. So if all else fails, like there's that.
And if that doesn't work, we have ALPN. Yeah.
Can we trade mics? Let's do that.
Yeah, sure. No,
Does that work?
Hello?
yes.
That's the wrong size.
Well, that's where we found it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so the next thing on the agenda is Will talking about the post-adoption changes to the catalog draft. I actually didn't see Will in the participant list, though. It's kind of an odd time of day for him, 2 a.m.
Will said he would not be at this meeting if you went to the hour.
Well,
And we knew he wasn't coming in person, but he's on the agenda for the next two things. And he made slides very early on. So, okay, so we're going to call an audible here. The next person that isn't Will, Mo, is you with low overhead container.
Actually, if he doesn't show up, I can do the catalog slides after if you want.
Okay.
Or co-author on that too. Okay, so this is the low overhead container or web codecs media format. Next slide, please. Version 3. Okay, so a quick overview of what it is. It's an alternative to CMAF. So for people who are not necessarily doing VOD or streaming from CMAF-based containers, this is a lower overhead alternative for that, particularly for something like audio. It's based on web codecs. That's kind of a misnomer because it's really not that related to web codecs. It's just that it wants to be at the lowest possible overhead, basically the elementary stream of the codec itself. And web codecs has already done some work to define that and package that up. So we're basically just reusing that. Then it also has the bindings to the catalog. So the catalog textual descriptions have some fields that depend on what the streaming format is, and this new version of the draft specifies those. And by low overhead, we mean low wire overhead, so less data on the wire, not a lot of extra encapsulation over the raw codec, and also less application overhead, so less runtime if you're interfacing with a primitive like web codecs. Next slide. So what are the problems with CMAF? Why can't we just standardize on CMAF? The main problem is for use cases where the media itself is small, CMAF is a lot of overhead. It's over 100 bytes, and it could actually be much, much larger than that, depending on if a lot of optional boxes are also present. So for something small like audio, it would more than double or triple the bitrate for an audio stream. There's also a lot of complexity with CMAF. There's a lot of rules about the boxes hierarchy and what could be nested in what. So if you're not an expert in MP4 boxes, CMAF is not a lot of fun. There's also some complexity in how the atoms in CMAF are defined. You can have, chunks, fragments, segments, all these different things that don't really directly map to frames. Whereas in web codecs, it's very clear what a frame is. The encoded chunks are frames. And so at some point, a media application has to deal with frames to forward them on to their decoders and renderers. And so LOC natively takes on frames, not different types of atoms, not subframes, not super frames, but just directly frames. And there's also, work in CMAF to find those frame boundaries. And with LOC, you already have the frame boundaries in a simpler way. So you don't have to parse deep into the CMAF containers to understand where the frame boundaries are. And like I said, every media application has to find those frame boundaries in order to pass those frames on to their decoders and renderers. So that's one of the advantages of using this format. Next slide. Okay, so the main thing here is that we're trying to map directly to what comes out of web codecs. So if you're using web codecs, there's a thing called encoded audio and video chunks, and there's an internal data field inside of that encoded audio and video chunk. And that encoded data, that internal data is basically the elementary bit stream. So whatever the codec specifies, if it's 264 or 5 or AAC or Opus, the raw elementary bit stream of the codec is what is in the internal data of the chunk. And that's what we're using directly in LOC as the payload. So the LOC payload maps directly to the raw elementary stream or the internal data of a web codec chunk. And we're not redefining all of the codecs that exist. We're not mapping anything onto what can be allowed or what shouldn't be allowed. We're using the web codec registry directly. So anything that's registered through web codecs would be usable by this container. It's also usable without web codecs. Like I mentioned, web codecs is just for convenience because it provides a registry of the different codecs that are in use and what those codecs elementary streams look like and what minimal mappings you have to do, like video parameter sets and things like that, the minimal mappings you have to do for those codecs. So you could reuse all of those things outside of web codecs. You could do this in a standalone application. And again, it would just be the raw elementary stream without the web codecs wrappers, without the extra fields beyond the encoded video and audio chunks the web codecs provides. Next slide. So the wire format is very simple. So you have every MOQ object has a header and then a payload. So the MOQ object payload for this container is also broken up into a payload header and then the actual payload. So the LOC header is a payload header inside of the MOQ object payload, and then there's the LOC payload. The LOC payload itself is just the raw elementary stream. So that's the internal data of a web codecs chunk, an encoded audio or video frame. And then the LOC header is metadata. And some of that metadata we may decide if relays need to be able to access that, then we may need to migrate some of that metadata over to the MOQ object header because we're assuming that all the object payloads are going to be likely to be end-to-end encrypted or DRM'd or in some way inaccessible to the relays. So if those fields are important for relay operation, then we may need to consider moving some of them to the mock object header. There's an IANA registry in the spec for all of these header fields. And there's two common ones, a timestamp and a sequence. The sequence we may be able to eliminate by mapping onto the mock level object and group IDs. It's not as easy as it sounds, but there's a new spec now for secure objects that hopefully will make that a little bit simpler, because the number spaces for object IDs and group IDs is not well defined yet. So directly concatenating them is not quite as easy, but we think that that's the right direction. And so that only leaves timestamp as the only common field, common object header field. And then there's specific fields for video and for audio. For video, there's frame marking flags to identify layers. And for audio, there's things like audio levels to be able to do things like switching without decoding. Next slide. So the updates in this version, the largest update, if you do a direct diff, it's a huge update. That's because we removed the catalog. Version 2 had the full mock catalog specified in there. We moved that off into a separate draft. So that's the common catalog that we'll be discussing about after this. That's the largest of the diffs. We now bind to that common catalog using what's called a lock streaming format. That's format type 2. Type 1 is CMAF, and now type 2 is lock. That's a typo. It should be LOC. And there's also this packaging format that's defined in the common catalog, and we use lock packaging format for all of these media types. And there's bindings for the base fields and the optional extensions. So the next slide will give you details about that. And then finally, for end-to-end encryption, we replaced the text around S-frame with the references to a newer design using MLS and a new draft called Secure Objects. Next slide. So these are the details of what the video and audio optional and base fields are. So we added the mappings. These are catalog bindings for temporal spatial IDs and dependencies. That's for doing things like scalable video. Render group, which is really time alignment, or in CMAF parlance, things like switching sets, ABR switching sets. And there's also selection parameters. And selection parameters are basically like a quality profile. So things like the codec, the frame rate, the bit rate, the width, height for video. For audio, we also have the render group or time alignment, and also the selection parameters. And for audio, the selection parameters are, again, the codec, the bit rate, but then also the sample rate, channel config, and language. Next slide. So the open issues, a lot of them are the same as last time, except for one new one. There's a question about whether we should separate the packaging container format from the mock streaming format. This is a little confusing because this was a new concept introduced by the Common Catalog of having both streaming formats and packaging formats. And I wish Will was here to talk about his view of that distinction, but I think the intent is that a packaging format could be used outside of mock. So you could package up the media in some way and use it with some other transport, whereas a streaming format is a binding itself to mock. So a streaming format has the semantics of objects and groups and stream mappings, how you map those objects and groups onto quick streams or datagrams. So the mock level bindings is supposed to be the mock streaming format, and anything that's independent of that, you could consider a packaging format. So that's still an open issue that we would need to separate this draft into just a container format that doesn't know about mock, and then a mock binding streaming format. So we can do that in a subsequent update. There's still also these other open issues from last time, from 117, video parameter sets, whether they should be in-band or whether there should be some provision to have them signaled in some other way, like as a group header or a track header. or even in the catalog itself. So CMAF has init segments for doing this. In real-time streaming cases, we never have separate init segments. We get them in band inside of the stream with the iframe that they're corresponding to. So we need to resolve that. Like I mentioned, some fields may migrate to the object header, may be able to eliminate the sequence by using the MOQ object header directly, the group ID and the object ID. And then do we need things like common header fields like the timestamp? Do those ever need to be visible to the relays? And if they do, then those need to be migrated to the object header also, MOQ object header. And right now we specify a content protection scheme using MLS and secure objects. Should we actually specify that in this, or should we just have a generic, support any generic content protection scheme, whether it's DRM based or whether it's MLS or secure objects based? Should this draft not talk about any of that and just leave it open for arbitrary extensions? Next slide.
There isn't a next slide.
That's it.
Questions? Questions or comments?
So I suspect Will is not still online because he was the main one that had questions and comments on the list about this.
I don't see him yet. I reached out to him a couple of ways. Cullen.
I mean, I was just going to say that, oops, oh yeah, this mic's on. This scene, when you think about what's here, yeah, sure, there's some open issues on this, but the basics of it is incredibly simple, very close to what we have in WebRTC, both in the optional header primers you can throw in and the other stuff. And I just think that this is, close enough to move forward with as a working group draft, even with, these questions will resolve slowly over time. So I would like to see us start moving this one into the working group at some point sooner rather than later.
Suhas?
Thanks, Mo, for the presentation. From 3 out of 4 implementations today, they support some form of lock. That kind of shows that this is something promising, and we need to kind of see how to make it to the next step. And with respect to what should be in the lock header versus what should be in the MOQ header, one of the goals for the MOQ from the very beginning has been to relays to be more media agnostic. Not to learn about different kinds of media that can go. That just makes implementation like an SFU complicated at some point. We need to kind of be careful and think about what kind of things are very specific to video versus what something more generic, and then consider if it's supposed to move in the MOQ header. And on the last question about should it support arbitrary content protection schemes, my slight preference would be to define a default one. That way, if someone using lock wants to build something, they would have a place to go look for it. Other than that, this is heading in the positive direction. Thank you.
Luke.
So as somebody who's had to deal with MP4 a lot, because I support CMAF for some reason, yeah, we need a simpler container. So I do support, making our own container, basically. I will say I would like to see it decoupled a little bit from MOQ transport. Like it's okay if there's some redundant sequence numbers or whatever, because I'd like to be able to serialize these to disk or something, and I don't want to have a separate lock on disk versus lock over the network format. But at the same time, if that's lower overhead, I'm all for it. Yeah, I keep it up. I think this is good.
So that's both Will and Luke talking about splitting this up into a streaming format versus a packaging container. Is there anybody that thinks that we should not? Anybody thinks that you should have this MOQ working group, just define a MOQ only?
I can't get on the queue. Sorry, Victor's at me.
I was going to ask what does splitting up here means, because what are the things that would go to the MOQ streaming format?
Sorry, Victor, wasn't into that.
What are the things that would go to the lock streaming format if you split them up?
Okay, so MOQ streaming format would basically be anything that references MOQ object IDs or group IDs, or stream mode mapping, object per group or object per, a group, stream per group or track stream or things like that. So those MOQ level bindings would define the streaming format. Anything that doesn't depend on any of those would be the packaging format.
I would not try to split those up, because even if you split those up, you would still need to bring them back in. Like if you want to take an MOQ stream and like you want to make it an on-disk container, you can't straightforwardly do that, because you're missing like the information in the catalogs that's needed to decode it, etc. So anything that where we like attempt to represent MOQ on disk, we would need some kind of format that would like let us merge all of those. So I would not be concerned too much at this point. I might have different opinion and comments if I read the draft more carefully, so I'll go to that.
Colin?
I mean, I'm fine with us going and doing like, hey, here's how it gets stored on disk or whatever. I'm not exactly, I mean, maybe I'd have to see the format and the streaming, what it exactly meant when it was all split up. But the only thing that I wouldn't want us to do, and I don't think anyone's proposing this, but is that somehow our on the wire format gets bigger because we're trying to make it match the on disk format, and the on disk format needed things like object IDs and group IDs. I wouldn't want to see us duplicate information that existed at the MOQ header level down here just because it matched the disk or something. I don't think anyone's proposing that, but like I like this design for the on the wire. And if the draft also specified like an on the disk thing format or as well that was slightly different for some reason, well, it would be slightly different for a variety of reasons and slightly larger. I mean, that seems fine to me.
Yeah, that's kind of my view too, is that if you're going to persist things, just persist the MOQ level stuff too.
Okay, I've cut the queue after Kiro.
Kiro Pugin method. Just observation, we kind of have experience with doing this because Rush was originally like basically what you're proposing. One of the challenges is like all the tooling doesn't work, obviously. So, and you have to, so the sooner it's become a standard, the sooner the tools are actually there. And yeah, storing is like, we're always going to store things in MP4s. We're not going to store things very likely in MOQ because just better, and we're going to have translate between those back and forth.
Yeah, I agree. So being able to stream MOQ on the wire, but store it as an MP4 would be a useful library.
Okay, so I think we're going to close that topic. You're comfortable talking to the catalogs slides?
If Will's not around, yeah, we can. I haven't seen him before, but we didn't collaborate on them, but we collaborated on the draft updates.
Just on LOC, I heard a lot of support in the room for this is good. We want to do it. We want MOQ to do this. Do we know what the next step is here?
Yeah, we can't adopt it if they're going to split it, right? So if it goes into two documents, we can't do the adoption call until we've seen the split and the working group says, yeah, okay, we now get how this still works together with the split document. So I think the next thing would be go ahead and split it and then bring it back to the working group, and then we can adopt after that.
Okay, so the decision is split. I only heard Victor object to splitting.
I thought we were going to still have one. I thought split still meant one draft. Just separate these as two concepts in the same draft. I mean, we don't need 50 RFCs out of this working group.
That's true. I mean, draft-wise, we could have one draft.
The way he's been talking about it is split it into two drafts. So if it's going to be in,
I was just confused then.
The current CMAF stuff is split into two drafts. There are two different drafts for the CMAF streaming format and the Luke, maybe help me. What's the other one called? Packaging format is not called packaging format. It's called something else.
Okay, so the chairs will work with you to determine whether it's one draft or two, but go ahead and split it mentally into either one draft that has two sections, which are clearly splitting the two different things that are happening there, or split it into two drafts, and then we'll work out what the adoption thing is after you've done one of those two things.
Okay.
Given that you didn't develop the slides, and one of our other things here is to go through transport issues, I think we'll go ahead to the transport issues. And if the transport issues run low, we'll pick up something from tomorrow, because we already had confirmation that we had the slides for the low overhead encryption if the transport issues don't take us the full time. So Ian, this brings you back up and transport issues. Yep.
Ted said it was okay. I'm sticking by my like all caps thing. Like all the slides have to be in the day before I leave my flight. That's still the party line in this working group. The slides will be presented.
But are you an enthusiast about his optimism?
Yeah. I'm a get your slides in the day before enthusiast.
So nothing has come through yet. Have you sent it?
Yeah. So the conversation earlier was motivating because I had slides and I reordered them based on the conversation before about TTL and other things. So
Yeah.
sorry. Okay. Yeah, no problem.
Because I'm not going to be able to upload them and get them done. I'll have to do it as a sharing screen.
Yeah. So I want to start with one I can start walking through. But right now, there are a number of issues about not necessarily being clear when a group ends or when a track ends. So when a track ends, one can indicate it via subscribe done. Say basically you're not going to get any more data, but that's a control kind of signal, not an in-band signal. For the object model and the forwarding preference, we kind of decided that we want an explicit signal whenever possible. And we wanted like an actual indication of, you know, this object goes on the stream, this group goes on the stream, this track goes on the stream. And so, yes. And so there's kind of an open question of, do we want an explicit signal for one or both, potentially both? There's an example PR out. But as much as anything, this is feedback from the group about like, we've kind of been heading in the explicit signal direction. It seems like where we would like to keep going. Do people generally agree with that direction? Or do we think this is a problem that doesn't need to be solved? And I think Alan is someone who's hit this before as an individual. I don't know if you want to comment.
I think Luke made it in the queue first, and the queue's locked.
Oh,
I should have a button to unlock it.
Sorry, I didn't realize there was a queue already. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. You said control streams can't be explicit, but isn't that pretty explicit? Or are we trying to say that it has to be in the data layer? I think is what I heard a few people say.
Yes, sorry. The control message is in the control stream. It is explicit. It is very clear, but it's not in the data layer. That's where I was making the distinction. So clearly, like that message is very clear. Like it's over. That's the end of the track. But in other spots, we've kind of decided we'd like putting in the data layer better. And so for capturing,
yeah, I don't think we've talked about the data layer before. I just want to say that we talked about explicit.
Yeah, so as an individual, I think we do want to have an explicit end of group signal. Right now, I think there's actually in the draft, it may just say like to do, figure out how these things end.
Yep.
And you can just you can currently do it when the quick stream ends, but I think there've been other use cases expressed where people like want to know like this was really the end of the group. Not just this stream ended possibly because my relay is, the thing I'm shutting down the connection or some other reason the stream is ending, but like, there's really the end here. I think that explicitly is useful. On subscribe done, I need to think about it more, whether you can at least sort of get it mostly done with subscribe done right now to mark the end of a track because there's tracking signals
so
right now.
Okay, that's good because it is explicit. That's fair. And then
But I agree, the end of stream is an unreliable signal. And for purposes of caching and such, you don't want like one cache to cache things one way and another to cache things entirely differently. So I think that's a valid concern. Suhas.
I think there are two dimensions here, right? One is that explicit versus implicit.
Suhas, can you speak up a little bit?
Okay, is it better now?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there are two different dimensions here. One is that do you want an explicit signal versus implicit signal, or do you want on another dimension is that is it on the control lane versus the data path? I think explicit signal always is useful because you know exactly what's happening. And on the control path versus data path, I would prefer anything that talks about data to be on a data path, because if you're implementing something at the closer to the hardware layer, you don't have to switch to some process and figure out what's happening. I can work at the line speed. That would be my preference, to have explicit and also on data path.
Thanks. I'm assuming Colin's next.
Yeah, plus one, we want explicit, we want a data path because of the timing issues as well as things. So, but I also think that just, it's the group, like you can see many ways to do the end of the track, but the end of the group is the one that just really pushes it here. And and I think that we'll probably decide to do once we decide how to do the group, we'll probably decide to do the track roughly the same way.
Mosinati +1 to explicit and in the data plane or in object area. From experience with RTP, this has always been a problem. You know, even when we had some things that were explicit, but they were ill-defined, like the marker bit, it was always a problem, and we had to define extensions and things in order to make that reliable. And you know, being able to know the end of something is very important. Waiting for the next thing adds latency. So I don't think that's ever acceptable for a protocol that's focused on low latency.
Thanks. Okay, awesome. Oh, we have more people. Yes,
Christian and then Luke.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we absolutely need an explicit signal. And I understand most point that the logical thing to do is to have something like a fin bit on the last object in a group. The problem I see is that it will be fairly frequent that a group is cut short. Because, for example, we do the mapping of one group per stream and we reset the stream. And if a group is cut short, you're not going to receive that last bit. The way I solved that when I was doing a prototype is to have a property on the first object of the next group saying, hey, the previous group was supposed to have so many entries. That's not necessarily ideal, but you have to consider the case where, especially in the case of group, there's been a reset of the stream, and you want to know how much you have lost exactly, in particular for cache management and things of that nature.
Yep. Thanks, Christian. Luke.
Yeah, I mentioned in the chat that I would like a signal when a group is dropped, like cut short, which falls very similar to also this is its known length or its known final size. So I think we should have an explicit message. I will say the problem with the data layer is it's lossy by nature. I mean, even with Christian's proposal, if you lose two groups in a row, you just lose information about the first one. So I know people don't like control messages, but I want something reliable. I want some way of saying this group is gone, or group 5 ended with 3. I cut it off early, but it should have been 30. Try fetching again later. And I think it should be a control message.
Yes. Yeah, that does lead into another issue, which is, yeah, like how do you know why you didn't get a certain object? But hopefully maybe we can work into that tomorrow if we have extra time. So thanks.
There's 22 minutes left in this session, and we thought we might, if you want to use this up to another 5 or 10 minutes, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. Wonderful. Next slide. Cool. So this is, the issue that we all love to talk about, or maybe we don't. but it's come up enough today that I thought it would be worth kind of rediscussing it. And we do have some slightly more specific proposals now, I think maybe than we have in the past. So there are a number of transmission issues. I think there's like 7 of them. Luke recently wrote up a proposal to do, I believe, the first 3 that I'm listing down the bottom. The current draft leaves this very, very unresolved. So, you know, at some point we need to do something about this. It's clearly a to-do, basically. But the core issue is right now, there's really no instruction as a relay or cache as to what you should send versus anything else. Nor is there, despite it being intended to be a potentially unreliable video transmission protocol and media transmission protocol, there's no advice whatsoever about when to drop anything or when to stop sending anything. So those are fairly big, like functional holes, I think. I mean, the latter one seems quite unfortunate. And so, okay, Alan? Sorry, did you?
I'm going to be lazy and not run over there, but speaking as an individual, so I think prioritization, and then you mentioned dropping at the end, and I think in my head those 2 things are kind of different, right? Like when you have a queue of things to send, you can make it a priority queue.
Yep.
And then there's, what do you do? Like no queue is infinite. So what do you do when your queue is too big?
Yes.
And sometimes, like, we have not defined, the draft doesn't say when it's okay to drop. So I don't know if we want to have that as part of the, how do we prioritize things? If you follow the chat, you see a lot of people talking about, is it a publisher signal? Is it a subscriber signal? Is it
Right.
both? How does the
Okay.
relay merge it? How many dimensions are there? Is it per track, per object, per group? So like there's all those things, which is just about how to manage the queue. And then there's the separate thing, which is what do we do when the queue's full?
I agree. Thank you for keeping me on task. And that's exactly what this subscribe slide is intended to cover. And there are the slides, if we get to them, that talk about TTL very briefly. And that would be, I think, a better time to talk about what to drop. Not to say that TTL is the only mechanism, it is a mechanism we've discussed. Yeah, so if we could focus on kind of the what to send, assume a machine with an unlimited amount of memory that you can buffer anything you want. What would you send, maybe for the purpose of this conversation? Mo.
Moses and Natty, I started a draft on priorities, I think three meetings ago, and made some headway and then hit some hard walls. This is not that simple of a problem. I don't think it's going to be a few lines or a few sections of the MOQ draft. I think having its own dedicated draft to deal with these issues, because there's not going to be one prescriptive thing that we can say this is the normative behavior of how you should prioritize things, because different applications have different needs. And that's what I started trying to enumerate. Some of the things that Luke wants to do for some use cases don't match up with what other people want to do for other use cases. So I think it's important to first lay out how those use cases work prioritization-wise, and then what are the mechanisms to achieve that, and then how those mechanisms interact with each other and how they interact with other prioritization mechanisms, because ultimately it's not just about what this MOQ layer does. It's about, does this actually make something get delivered? And so that means you also look at things that are under you, look at QUIC under you, and look at what's under you at network layers. And so having all of those being considered is out of scope for just the MOQ section. I think it needs its own draft to talk about all
So
those things.
a clarifying question from the chairs. You are still anticipating, though, that any MOQ mechanisms that were implied by that draft would end up in the MOQ draft, right?
Yes, it would have some text would need to go into the MOQ draft as well.
Okay, as long as the MOQ draft tells you what you need to implement to have a conformant MOQ implementation, that's what we need. And having it split at this point so that the prioritization stuff was in a completely different draft would make some of what we just talked about on subscribe fetch behavior difficult to reason about. So I think if you want to have a separate draft for the use cases and the implications, that's all cool. But I think any protocol mechanisms that you derive from that still need to go back into MOQ.
Yes, I can reprioritize that prioritization draft, especially the sections that would go back into MOQ itself.
Yeah.
For the next meeting.
One comment. I agree. It's not. I don't think this is a trivial issue at all. But what we don't have anything in the draft de facto. I mean, I could write a PR to just nuke the current text, and it would be equally functional. And so I guess I'm trying to get feedback about like, do we want to add any of these specific proposals that have been discussed in the past from the group? And that's, but I agree that like I think what Ted said about, well, but yeah.
The problem is I don't think any of the specific proposals work in general for everybody's use cases. They work for a certain defined use case.
Sure.
And so I think I'll try to revive what was done before and put it either in this issue or create a new issue for it.
Yeah, no, definitely. That would be very helpful. There's a few issues, but post on any of them or create a new one. We have a long queue.
Luke is next.
Yeah, Mo, if you can bring up some use cases and like add some specifics, that would be helpful. Because I think I've been the biggest proponent of like publisher chooses priority and kind of just encodes the priority almost like with the media. I'm doing a complete like 180 right here and saying subscribers in charge because I think that actually handles use cases. It means that somebody can be watching and having a small window and request a different priority than somebody with a big window. It starts actually solving a lot of these issues we're talking about with the subscriber in charge. So I think this at least is better than the current draft. I don't think it's perfect. I think there is one wart about what a relay is supposed to do. Other than that, though, I think it's better.
Thanks. To answer this conversation, I didn't put in the slides, but there is some kind of time pressure to do something, I would argue, because any type of client-driven ABR probably needs something vaguely functional here to allow you to switch from like a lower resolution to higher resolution and vice versa. And so like doing something would be helpful, even if it's not perfect. Thanks.
Colin Jennings, I mean, I agree with what you just said. The whole draft, the whole thing is probably useless without prioritization at some level, right? Okay. I mean, really, if we get down to it. But this is a really complicated topic. It is very data-driven and use case-driven, and we need to bring all of those together. And what the chairs had decided a while back was we were not going to discuss it for a while. So I certainly don't want to go adding these in today or whatever. I don't think these are the right way to do it. But I think that that's not really, we need to meta up level here, which is, what's the right way to come to good decisions and designs about this and agreement on this? And I think that probably we're going to need to have like a full interim where we do nothing but bring, you know, I mean, what we said before is we need implementations. We now have implementations that implement a bunch of these different schemes. We can see how they work. We can compare them to each other, understand what the problems really are, discuss what people did, discuss what worked, look at the requirements, look at this. I think that this needs, you know, about 20 hours to make progress on it. And then we'll get things. I mean, it'll be very hard to get to anything before that. So my proposal would be all of these things that fall into the category of, now, and again, I split with Alan the same way. There's one thing which is the only thing a relay can ever really decide is what object do I send next? And there's also the issue of what objects do I discard? Which objects we discard, we might be able to make progress with on less time than this. Maybe, maybe not. But though, which ones to send next? I think that's a very difficult. I think that the only way we'll come to agreement is a huge block of time.
Okay, thanks. Suez.
I plus one to Colin. We had quite a few discussions. It's not that we had talked this one. There's huge mailing list discussions on send order versus priority, sender versus receiver. We had a lot of discussion, and as a group, we decided to pause on it for the exact same reasons. And like for example, my implementation does priorities on sender based, and it works for our use case. And I can see why something like a fetch requires, because if you don't have delivery order, you need a different way to say, probably we need to think about it. But the way the proposal has been designed today will not work for some of the use cases that I'm considering, for example. So I will not be comfortable getting this until we have a separate discussion on it.
Thanks. Lucas.
Hello, Lucas. So based on my experiences with HTTP and QUIC and H3, I don't want to go into all of that and whatever. Like, ultimately, the relay always has to decide what to send. Right? It's the one stuck in this awkward position of the middle of not really being the thing that has to render anything or the thing that's producing anything. And it's really tricky, and it has to determine this anyway, regardless of what signals we might decide to allow for the client or the server. I appreciate Jana's point that we want to keep things simple, But like in my experience, and it kind of echoes some of what Mo and Colin said, like there's different kinds of use cases that need to be supported. And what I learned through the HP priorities process is you think you've described every possible permutation of what might go wrong, and you want to be very prescriptive, but you can't. You need to accommodate things. You need to accommodate the fact that there's other kinds of signals that aren't explicit that a relay would want to use, such as operational experience, that they know there's always a certain kind of client that says something and it's lying because that's just how they are. I think this work has to be done. I don't know if it has to be done right now. I think it's going to take a lot of time. I think even as we progress the drafts through like IETF last call, people will keep figuring out things we didn't consider and we'll be adding more and more text. So trying to be too lean right now on that and trying to hide the complexity and shift it to implementations won't help us. But we need data, really. That's what's, otherwise we're just, no, I won't use the thing I was going to say. Yeah, we need data.
Sure, thanks.
John.
Jana Iyengar, I obviously agree with the fact that we need data. But the thing I'll say is that two things. First, several of us have worked on priorities in many different spaces and we've been burned badly by it and we don't want to do it ever again. But here we are. And I say, let's embrace this. And that's my second point. I think it's much more important here than it was in HTTP. It's much more relevant to the actual performance of your thing. And the goal here is not to necessarily figure out what the right priorities are. The question is to figure out what the right primitives are again, right? And then let people go play with it, because that can help you, again, gather the right data. So my recommendation here would be, or my suggestion to the chairs is, if you can like create the conversation here while we are here at the IETF, sort of allow room for use cases, any data requirements to be presented and discussions to happen now, and then move it into the interim after that. That's an ask of the chairs.
Yep. All right, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I think probably an interim focused on this is probably in the plans for the working group, and we'll discuss that I think tomorrow a little bit. I would say that one valuable thing people might talk about over beverages or breaks is, what are the primitives you need to get the data you need, right? Because if you don't have anything in the draft, don't have anything to interoperate around, getting the data that's going to help you figure out what each one of these client server relay need to do is going to be difficult. So if over the breaks and beverages, you can think about what's going to enable you to get the data, not just from your own implementation, but from interoperation, that I think would make it a huge step forward and mean that whenever we do have an interim, it's not just talking about it, but actually making real decisions. So I think.
Thank you. That'd be enormously helpful. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So we have 9 minutes to go. We have a choice of either doing more on this or leaping forward to tomorrow and doing the lightweight encryption for MOQ.
Do you want to talk through more things?
Do you want to talk through more things?
We're
Or
already up.
I'm okay with doing lightweight encryption. I would like some more time to like talk to folks about a few things, and maybe like a run through would end up leading to a more productive conversation on this and other things.
Okay, so we'll switch then to the lightweight encryption.
Colin, that's you.
And
10, 8.
Actually, I don't see the slides for this. You told me there were slides, but I don't see them.
There were.
Are they pending approval?
Don't think so.
Secure object?
Oh, maybe I'm looking for that.
Oh, sorry, they're on the second day. I submitted them the second day, not the first day.
Okay, so I can't reach them yet. I have to go and get them out of the second day, resubmit them into it. That's why I do everything for every day.
Can you just share them? No?
Maybe. Give me a chance.
I'm just going to add that when Ted grabbed the mic from me and said the thing about the priorities, that was exactly the same thing I was going to say, because we are just of one mind up here. Yeah, what I wanted to, are we missing some places where we need to be able to put some experimental signals so that we can have interoperable implementations, but still be gathering that priority data. So.
I mean, what I would point out, there's two very specific proposals in the draft that have been there for a year or whatever, and people could deliver some of the experimental data from those.
Those are only publisher side signals, and there's been some proposals for, do we need subscriber side? Do we need a place for there to hold subscriber side signals?
It would be really great to get some data on how those publisher side signals work.
I just want to quickly say that I did have send order in production for a while, and it does work, at least for the HLS dash use case. But that's the only data I got.
I don't have this. So maybe you approved it or something?
If I get them up on a screen, can you just screen share from my computer?
Well, if you can get them up on a screen, you can screen share them directly. We can grant you the right to screen share.
Oh, right.
We can just beat everybody to the snack break.
That's getting really appealing by the moment.
Yeah, it's got 6 minutes to go. Okay, so instead of doing this, let's actually leap forward to the question of the interim, and ask people if you're here today, either online or there, whether you'd be able to dedicate a couple of full 2 days to a discussion of prioritization in an interim between now and the Vancouver IETF, or are we looking at this because of the data issues to be after Vancouver? And so I'm going to run a show of hands tool, because why not? That says before Vancouver, say yes if you think before Vancouver, say no if you think it needs to be after Vancouver.
You're seeing a priority focused virtual interview.
Yep. So yes is you think it's ready before Vancouver, no thinks it's not ready before Vancouver, and no opinion is the third choice, which means you don't know, but you like pressing buttons. Yeah, I like pressing buttons might actually win. But I'll notice out of the 69 people here, less than half have actually pressed any button. So there's,
I mean, for me, I couldn't figure out which button to press because I'm unsure if we're going to have the data that we need to present in the time before Vancouver. And so I'm kind of my gut says maybe not, which is why I want to press no, but there are lots of votes for yes. I don't want to stand in the way of progress.
okay, so I think we've concluded that the show of hands tool is not going to help us make this decision. So that's always useful data, you know. This turns out so let's actually do that. We'll try and get people to meet over beverages and breaks to figure out what prioritization experiments they can run or data they can get. And then from those discussions, bring them back to the chairs, and we'll discuss at that point the scheduling question of when this would actually happen. And there are two people in queue. That's Jana and Victor, and Martin is not in queue, but he's standing there, which might be an AD thing. Jana.
Jana Iyengar. First, it seems to me like there are a lot of people who do want to have the discussion. So, I mean, to me, that was a rough consensus that we should have it if you were looking for that. But that's, I mean, the question that I ask is, what specific data are we talking about here? Data is a very big word. And it's not clear to me exactly what we're looking for to decide whether to have the discussion or not. I would rather have the discussion with whatever data people can bring, and then figure out what other data would be more useful. If people have it, it's, unless somebody says, I've got this magical thing that's going to happen in June, and therefore we have to wait until Vancouver. I just don't know why we wait.
Okay, Victor?
Yeah, I'm kind of really surprised by the show of hands. I'm really excited to see from all of those 17 people the data that they have, because I've been working on that core quite a while, and I'm not sure I would be able to produce it even for Vancouver itself, not even in the interim time frame. But to clarify, I am actively working on this, but
Martin?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to dispute that show of hands was ambiguous. Like, I thought we had a bunch of people who seemed really excited to do something. Very few people who thought it was a terrible idea, and a bunch of people like me who like really don't know how to start on this whole priority thing. And if somebody's got an idea, that's great. But I mean,
So I agree that there's very little opposition, right?
Yeah.
There's only 4 people who were pretty convinced that we wouldn't have enough data. But it's pretty evenly split between yes and no opinion, which we defined as it's not clear whether we're ready. So I think delaying it to the end of the week so that people can have side conversations while we're here, and then the chair is making the call at the end of the week seems sensible enough, if that's okay.
yeah,
with you.
there's certainly no hurry. I mean, we can do it after. We can declare this after IETF. if
Yeah,
we want.
I think
Yeah,
people will have the side conversations of what data they can get by an interim and how that's going to help. Because I think the use cases are going to be something that we could definitely get before an interim, but data based on them, especially if you want to get something that says, hey, the client says this, my relay does this, the upstream says that, and here's how I resolved it, to kind of go to Lucas's point. That can be complicated, and we could end up with a prioritization scheme that works fine for the client's perspective, but is like an incredible burden on a relay if we don't have data that says what the relay side of this has to deal with. So figuring out the data is, I think, a good first step. Okay, it is the close of today's meeting. We have another meeting tomorrow. Oh, no, he's not. He wasn't.
I was just going to quickly second Ted's point with use cases. I'd love to talk about the use cases prioritization before anything data or decision based. That's all.
Okay. Thanks, Luke. Thanks. So we're at the break. Remember, we have a meeting tomorrow, and please do take advantage of both this breaks and all of the other breaks to chat with the other folks interested in MOQ to see about how we can make further progress. Thanks.
It's really not like him at all.
No, it's just like a weird time of day. I think he's probably just...
It's not that crazy. Oh, thank you for remembering.
This is it's kind of a wacky suggestion. But since I think in the future chairs, there might be maybe something to find a meet in Seattle. We can actually do the Thursday and Friday before Vancouver.
I can't.
Hey,
you can't.
Saturday before Vancouver, my wife's cousin is getting married in New Hampshire. So we're going to be in. I may not even